morning. Olufon is the founder of Iwa Consulting. You're welcome to the program.
Thank you. Good morning.
I appreciate the indigenous touch in the name of your company.
Yes.
At least sending our language out abroad.
Exactly.
Well done on that.
Thank you. Thank you.
So you've written some articles on all talking about the silent tax. What's that?
Yes. So the silent tax is something that you cannot see. So for every transaction, you don't see it on the line of every business ledger. It doesn't show up as a line item on a budget, but it's one that's paid daily, and it shows up in every transaction. So when we think about it, some of the ways that you can calculate it is you can start calculating it by looking at the cost of capital, right? Africa risk premium. When governments borrow globally, there's an additional cost that's added onto that, and it's estimated to run in the billions of dollars. Now, economists argue different factors, but two things that consistently show up is the credibility as well as the trust in government systems, which add on this additional cost. Now, when global markets can't see clearly or read clearly government institutions, their policies, or their track record, they place a premium on this uncertainty. And this is where you see the silent tax come in at a country level. A second place where you can measure this is the cost of delivery. So you're implementing a program in a community, but the community does not trust the systems that are implementing this. So you find either the program fails, or there's a redesign of this program mid-implementation, or even the impact does not affect the community it was meant to serve. Now, there is never a line item that says the cost of this redesign is due to a trust gap, but it is. A third place where this shows up is the cost of opportunities, where partnerships fail, where investors go somewhere else. Not because the ideas behind them aren't strong, but because the credibility has not been built where it feels safe to say, yes, let's invest here. So none of these, again, appear on any line item in any budget, but each of them can be traced, they can be quantified, and they can be attributed to a trust gap.
So who is paying it at the end of the day?
At the end of the day, it is the institutions. The government is paying it in the example I gave, for instance, that additional cost they have to pay to borrow money. The private sector or businesses are paying it because here you're losing opportunities because there's that credibility gap. And most importantly, the citizens are paying it because they don't trust the institutions.
They're even missing out on the benefit. For instance, the minister there was talking about the reforms and what the country ought to benefit or has benefited. Mm-hmm. And then the World Bank chief economist was asking, so has it reflected in the life of the people? Mm-hmm. I guess that gap could be explained by this silent tax, which is the lack of trust, because it's a huge one in Nigeria. Mm-hmm. Citizens hardly trust any policy that comes from the government.
Exactly.
But can we eliminate it or at least reduce it?
I think it's interesting that you said, well, it can be reduced, but it's
not eliminated.
Well, eventually, just like anything, when you think about.
So let me ask: in the very developed world, mm-hmm. do they pay this silent tax? You stay in the U.S. also, yeah?
So I'm based in both countries, so I.
So you have an experience.
So yes.
So I can safely ask you.
Yes.
In the U.S., for instance.
Yes.
Is there silent tax? Is there the lack of trust?
Of course, there's trust deficits everywhere, both in Africa and developed countries like the United States. But what is different is that in Africa, the consequences, which you have just alluded to, are compounded, right? So innovation penalty is higher here because the credibility infrastructure is still being built. So trust deficit is not unique to Nigeria. In every institution, every country, at every level, even in personal relationships, interpersonal relationships, there is a trust deficit. The only difference is that in African markets, it's compounded because the credibility infrastructure is thinner. And I'll give you an example. A startup coming up in Lagos versus a startup coming up in London that are having the same solution. For the startup in Lagos, they will face more due diligence, they will face more risk pricing, and they will face more time improving their legitimacy. So the argument is not necessarily lower the standards when you're looking at African countries. The argument is that for institutions here to continue to build the credibility required to reduce the cost, this silence tax that we're doing, and hopefully eventually eliminate it.
Yeah, so I guess this is one reason. I don't know if you heard about institutions like Afrexim Bank and AFDB talking about having Africa's credit rating agency because it costs more for Africans to borrow because of this perception of risks. So interest rate is higher for an African country to borrow and all of that. But I guess if Africa has its own rating agency, then Africa can rate itself, borrow itself, and also determine the interest rate based on what they have. So I guess on individual level, on country level, and even on the continent level, this infrastructure, trust infrastructure you're talking about needs acceleration.
Exactly.
But I don't know who or when or how we will be able to achieve it because everybody is involved. For instance, in Nigeria, politics is around the corner. You have politicians come and make a lot of promises, and yet, you know, so I mean, we're even seeing a voters' appetite because of that. So I mean, it seems like a complicated cycle, and solving it, I don't know where to start from the middle or where.
Well, solving it starts from every level, right? And a few things that I would say, because again, I am a communications person. So for me, I look at it from the lens, and the expertise I would bring when we're thinking about solving it is stop treating your communications at whatever level as an event, but treat it more as a system, right? So if there is what builds trust is the continuous, consistent communications on your track record on what you're doing. But also within that, we can't keep, you know, they say it's not what I do, but it's how I do it or what you see me do. So beyond just communicating consistently, it's also trust is built when what you say matches what you do. So that's one way to solve it. Another is measure trust the same way you measure revenue. People are fixated on data, they're fixated on the policy, they're fixated on the promises, but how are you measuring the trust that comes out of it? And you can do this in several ways. You can do it through surveys, you can do it through feedback mechanisms or relationship audits. So again, give this trust that we're talking about, make it just as important as revenue, because based on what I said earlier, it's costing you just as much, and there's leakage based on this. And I think the third is make sure your narrative matches your reality. In the next decade, African companies that design themselves based on and focusing more on the trust and their credibility are obviously going to do more and are going to define how people see Africa on the continent or our businesses more than those that are well funded. Because again, you started this conversation saying Iwa is authentic, and any Yoruba person, it's a Yoruba word that says character. So ultimately, at the end of the day, it is really businesses that show and place emphasis on implementing and strengthening their credibility, not just those that are well-funded, that determine how we look in Nigeria.
Well, I must say, even if I don't agree with you anything, the communication part, because I mean, now we're talking about, subsidy savings and all of that. Yes. Imagine if the government at the end of every month says, this month of January, this is how much we save from subsidy, from the removal of subsidy. This is what we are channeling it at. And then this road, for instance, where China is going to be ready in 3 months, and then in 3 months, or at least in the first month, people see work has started, and they know it's from the savings of the subsidy. And then February, they come again and say, this is how much we saved. So, I mean, that gap, I think, at least will close, even if it's not total, a huge part of it, because of communication. Well, we hope we'll preach this message more, and I'll preach the Iwa message more, and hopefully we'll get there. Thank you so much for your time. Olufunke Olufon, founder of Iwa Consulting.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Good to have you.